The news and opinions expressed on Occupy Radio may not necessarily reflect the views of KWVA Eugene, the University of Oregon, or the Associated Students of the University of Oregon.
From KWVA in Eugene and the Occupy Eugene Media Group, this is Occupy Radio, an extended conversation about the issues which gave rise to the Occupy movement. I'm your host, David Getchy, Sierra Lupe.
And I think the idea of the commons says there's another vision of development that is based on a radically different set of values and human relationships than the market enforces. So I think what we're seeing in a variety of different arenas is the struggle between this idea of the commons, of a shared inheritance of stewardship, against those who simply want to privatize it for the capital accumulation and concentrated power. And this is, I think, really a defining struggle of our time.
The commons are as old as humanity, occupiers, and they may offer a new paradigm for addressing our sticky web of problems that we face in economics, politics, and culture. This week on Occupy Radio, we interview David Bollier, a writer and researcher, about the history, importance, and applications of this radically different approach to managing resources and people.
Howdy, occupiers, and welcome to Occupy Radio. I'm David Getchy, Sierra Lupe, but you can all call me Getch, and I'm here with Rivera's son, who is experiencing a very unusual summer out there in Taos, New Mexico. So how's summer treating you these days, Rivera?
It is wet out here. You know, I look out across the mesa and it is turning green again. We have had rainstorms every day for the past month, and I think we have another week ahead of us for sure, and possibly longer than that. This is the traditional time for monsoons. Well, they call them monsoons, which in Maine, where I come from, originally we would call that a light shower. But we usually get about 2 weeks of this right about now, but we've been having this go on every day since the 4th of July, and, you know, it's great for the desert in some ways. It's also leading to flash floods. We had one the size of the Rio Grande go through the Earthship colony a couple days ago, and Albuquerque, New Mexico, in addition to having cop problems, which our listeners can look forward to hearing more about next week, Albuquerque did get flooded out downtown, where they had 1 foot to 2 feet of water running down the street. It was pretty incredible photos.
But I'll bet nobody got shot by cops that week.
You know, that's an interesting question. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, let's hope so. You know, for politics or whatever aside, let's just hope that they were able to keep their guns in their holsters for a week while they were helping their fellow citizens fight the floods.
Right, yeah. So, as I mentioned before, our listeners can look forward to hearing more about Albuquerque Police Department with our guest David Correa next week. But this week, we had a lot of events happen between the now and the last time you listeners heard from us. It's been busy here in New Mexico.
Yeah, for starters, August 2nd, a very big event, the birthday of my co-host, Rivera's son.
That's true. I did have a birthday. I'm now 16.
All right.
Just kidding. That wasn't really truth in reporting. No.
So there's a multiplying factor in there somewhere.
Yeah, not quite, but yeah. 32. 32 this year and counting. It's a good year. But, you know, for my birthday, we went down to Los Alamos National Laboratory with John Deere and Pax Christi Santa Fe, and we did a sackcloth and ashes peace vigil in commemoration of the Hiroshima bomb being dropped, which actually happened on August 5th or 6th, I forget which, but we went up there on the 2nd. And the sackcloth and ashes is one of the oldest forms of protest. It was in the Bible about, you know, people are so ashamed of themselves and the behaviors of their people that they took off all their clothes and put on sackcloth, which is like burlap and very itchy and uncomfortable. And they dumped ashes on their heads and sat in piles of ashes, which is also very uncomfortable. We didn't go that far extreme, but it was quite a reflective thing to acknowledge that I feel quite ashamed of our country's behaviors for a very long time period on this continent and around the world, that we have perpetrated genocides on the Native Americans. We built and dropped atomic bombs. We signed a nuclear non-proliferation treaty and then have violated it constantly and consistently since we did that.
We are an elite power, and therefore such things don't apply to us.
Yeah, so they like to think, but when you start to erode what they call the rule of law, then you start to get into a territory where the rule of force is what takes over. And when you're talking about a world that now has tons of nuclear weapons, rule of law is a helpful thing to avoid massive destruction. I mean, we're seeing that in Gaza right now, where Israel is perpetrating war crimes, violating the rule of laws that govern war. I mean, I think we shouldn't have war to begin with. And just there's total devastation happening.
And as we've already said, it's not equal at all. And what's weird nowadays is listening to the rationalizations coming from within Israel. There was a post of a member of the cabinet who was rationalizing how you can commit genocide because they're forcing you to commit genocide.
Mm-hmm.
The Gazans are forcing their own genocide at the hands of Israel.
Yeah, I think there's just so much coming out right now that is just absolutely jaw-dropping, not just in the acts being perpetrated, which are terribly violent and destructive. It's horrific in Gaza right now, but also in the behaviors of our elected elites. And, we watch them quite often, and we shouldn't be surprised. But, I mean, it's important for Americans to understand that our power class has uniformly supported Israel in this. And we aren't even talking about war crimes. We're not even talking about, is this an overreaction to what's going on? We're not even making any motions to stopping the violence, which our nation has in its power, the very effective sanctioning powers of removing U.S. aid to Israel.
And just not giving them more weapons.
Right. That would be a wonderful first step.
I think so.
I will say that on the day we went to Los Alamos, we brought half of our Love in Action network there. But another contingent went down to Santa Fe to speak with our Senator, Tom Udall, about why he is not standing up against the war crimes. But it's, New Mexico is a militarized state. We have a lot to protest and demonstrate about, and it's an ongoing, sustained effort to work against violence and militarism here.
But that all has been what's been going on. But what we're going to head into now is a talk with David Bollier, who is going to take the both of us through the plight of the commons. David Bollier describes himself as an author, activist, blogger, and consultant who spends a lot of time exploring the commons as a new paradigm of economics, politics, and culture. David has had a hand in authoring or editing several books on the commons, from Silent Theft, the Private Plunder of Our Commons Wealth in 2002, Brand Name Bullies, the Quest to Own and Control Culture in 2005. He published The Wealth of the Commons, A World Beyond Market and State in 2012, and David's most recent book is Think Like a Commoner, a short introduction to the life of the commons. David was a founding editor of onthecommons.org, and he is a senior fellow at the Norman Lear Center at the USC Annenberg School of Communication. We spoke with David from his home in Amherst, Massachusetts. David, I want to thank you for coming on Occupy Radio today. I'm very much looking forward to discussing the commons with you.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, David, I think this is one of the more interesting, both ancient and very modern themes that we can circle around. And I think we should just start off by explaining what are the commons and where did this notion come from?
Well, the commons is a way of organizing a community and managing resources that really goes back to ancient times. It's probably been with us from the beginning of humanity. But for the past, say, 200 years or more, it's been eclipsed by this whole market culture and sensibility. And it's only been rediscovered in the past, I'd say, 10 or 20 years as a entirely feasible, constructive, even wildly successful way of groups of people to manage resources outside of the market and outside of the state. So it's a new kind of self-organized management of resources and asserting of shared values and practices.
Mm-hmm. And taking things in the exact opposite direction, the commons of where our government is taking things right now. Our government is heading in the exact opposite direction. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I think that we operate under what I call a market-state duopoly, where the market and state act as partners collaborating on a shared vision of the privatization and marketization of as much as possible. And within the world of the commons, we often talk about this as enclosures of the commons, meaning the privatization and commodification of things. And this comes from English history, especially in the 17th and 18th century, when the aristocrats and landed gentry essentially privatized the common pastures and forests and orchards and so forth that commoners used as a matter of household survival. They basically privatized them so that they could make money out of it, selling the fruits of the orchards or the wool from sheep to the marketplace. Well, that's sort of the metaphor, or in some ways the template, for what's happening today, where corporations and capital, private investors, are essentially privatizing everything from public lands and the airwaves, the internet, the human genome, whatever can be enclosed with private property rights and sold, they're attempting to do so. So the commons is a way of trying to, first of all, name that whole process, and then to assert different ways of managing the resources that are self-governed and independent of both market and state.
What would be some current examples of a commons-based system in operation right now in our world?
Well, there's actually many, many such commons operating. Oftentimes, they're not really expressed or seen in terms of the commons, but you can see the internet as one big hosting infrastructure for commons where any number of people can get together and say, let's manage this resource together as for our purposes instead of a corporate purpose. So you have things like free and open source software. You have Wikipedia, and it's just dozens of offshoots of wikis. You have open access scholarly publishing. You have a lot of collaborative websites. So there's a lot of digital commons that are quite common there. But internationally, an estimated 2 billion people depend upon subsistence commons, meaning forests and fisheries, irrigation water, farmlands, in which they're managed as commons, not as private property or market resources. Yet most economists really ignore or dismiss these subsistence commons because, after all, there's no market exchange going on, so how could it possibly be valuable? Yet it is really providing daily nourishment to a good quarter of the planet's population. So I could go on to many other types of unusual commons, from urban spaces to, well, the commons, you have to understand, is not about the resource itself. It's about the community. And so any type of community can get together and say, let's manage this as a resource, as a commons, I mean. So, for example, you have a group of surfers in Hawaii who manage access and the protocols for surfing the waves as a commons. It's the allocation of a scarce resource that the group of people decide collectively. And they do this for safety reasons as well as for fairness. There's a group in Boston called HowlRound, which is a self-styled theater commons that has brought together nonprofit theater people so that they don't try to just mimic commercial theater, but develop their own authentic local-based theater. So I'm just citing those as an illustration of how you can have really wildly diverse types of resources and still be a commons. We shouldn't confuse the commons with the resource itself.
Is one of the distinguishing characteristics of the commons, not just the resource, but the way of managing it, or the way of, I don't know if you even say ownership of it, so much as stewardship of the resource.
Well,
is that a distinguishing characteristic?
That's a very good point. It's about stewardship, not the ownership of private property rights. And so, therefore, the community that manages the resource as a steward will be doing so for the long term with an eye towards future generations. It will be focused on fairness and inclusiveness. It will allow the commoners themselves to devise rules that make sense to them and are seen as fair, and therefore the commoners will help enforce those rules. And you can see actually some of these dynamics in such unusual circumstances as Burning Man, which is kind of this ad hoc city for an entire week of more than 60,000 people, in which they've helped make the rules and they self-govern themselves, and there's no external authorities saying you have to do it this way. So yes, the commons has a different ethic and set of social practices than either the market or the bureaucratic state.
The way that we're discussing it, it sounds almost anarchistic. The concept of the breaking away from an overarching authority and everybody putting their own hands into the pie and working together.
I think that's absolutely true, with the proviso that many anarchist communities don't like to think that there need to be infrastructures or top-down design agreements, so to speak. Even Burning Man, for example, has certain protocols that the entire community has to respect, and they have street design and other rules that help constrain just absolute license. In other words, it's not just individual self-restraint or responsibility. There can be certain design or infrastructure parameters that help guide it. That said, individuals have a whole realm of agency and responsibility as well as entitlements. And so it's not as if they're just passive consumers or passive citizens who are being provided by institutions. They're taking responsibility for themselves. And I might add, contributing a lot of innovation and energy and enthusiasm, which perhaps wouldn't occur to institutions. So yes, it has a lot of flavors familiar to anarchism, but with a twist.
What happens when these contemporarily radical notions of the commons collide with our current system of privatization and private ownership? And I think when I look at private ownership, I think we also have to look at state ownership as a form of privatization, because it says that we, the state, control all this ostensibly for the public good, but as we're seeing in America, that's not really true.
Well, I think this is exactly what's going on right now, is I think a huge cultural and political collision between private property forms as enforced by large corporations in the state and other forms of access and use that are managed by communities, which assert values beyond the market. And I think that this is really one of the preeminent struggles of our time. One of the big scandals of our time are just the countless enclosures of the commons. The idea that 20% of the human genome is now privately owned through patents, and that individual words like Mick and McDonald can be trademarked and prevent other people from calling your restaurant McVegan or McSushi. The idea that forms of life are being patented and controlled. We don't talk about this, or at least the mainstream political dialogue doesn't want to talk about this because it's so focused on market and technological progress as the vehicle for civilizational improvement. And I think the idea of the commons says there's another vision of development that is based on a radically different set of values and human relationships than the market enforces. So I think what we're seeing in a variety of different arenas is the struggle between this idea of the commons, of a shared inheritance of stewardship, against those who simply want to privatize it for the capital accumulation and concentrated power. And this is, I think, really a defining struggle of our time.
Seems like it's the essence of the Chief Seattle quote, where how can you own the land, kind of. You're familiar with the quote?
Yes. And I think a lot of this comes down to there's an important idea of inalienability. This isn't for sale. And the political consensus of public life can't even think about that idea. The idea that something should be off limits to the market does not compute, can't be talked about without you being seen as some sort of radical fringe. And I think that this is a notion that we need to challenge, that there's different notions of the public good and commonwealth, as some states used to call themselves, that we need to recover and put forward. And so it's really about changing the political dialogue that we have, which is something Occupy, of course, really helped pioneer a few years ago, and I think is still pushing forward and trying to expand that sensibility.
I think we're seeing a couple of very interesting collisions of, I think we could almost call it humanity's inherent notion of the commons and the assault on the commons, one of which is our internet, which is undergoing another level of assault right now. But then the other one is in Detroit with the water crisis. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I've been following that. I think you're right that the idea of social cooperation and the importance of inclusiveness and fairness, I think, is really very deep in the human species. A lot of evolutionary scientists are showing that cooperation is really what has helped us advance as a species over time, and that these really radical notions of a asocial homo economicus, in which human beings are purportedly rational, utility maximizing, self-interested, materialistic, the fiction that economists use, is really only a very partial story of who we are as human beings. But our political life and culture doesn't really acknowledge or give meat and gristle to the larger idea of us as a cooperative species who can have all sorts of high-minded, public-spirited, as well as self-interested goals, but self-interest in a different sense. So I think you mentioned Detroit. This is playing out there when the idea of something that's essential to life, water, is being cut off and no provisions being made for having sustainable access to it. I mean, it's just barbaric. One could say that a lot of commoners in the 12th century, when the Magna Carta was formed, had greater rights as commoners than contemporary ones, because the Magna Carta gave you guaranteed legal rights as set forth in the Magna Carta and the so-called Charter of the Forest, which was a companion document, gave you legal access to the forest and nature to meet your basic survival needs of your household. Well, nowadays, if you don't have the money, you don't have access to those basic things. So in some ways, we're going a step backward. But I think that there is an element in humanity that says, this is not fair, this should not stand. And that's why I think we have so many of these struggles going on against advanced capitalism.
And the Detroit water situation takes that all one step further in that not only is there a government-sanctioned move to restrict a common resource, the water in this case, but additionally, the government is backing that up by arresting people who supply water to people who get cut off. This is just a headline I read, so I don't know the whole story.
Well, I don't know more details than that either, but I can say this. It's very common for those who enclose the commons to criminalize commoning, meaning the idea of sharing and mutual provision and mutual support are made against the law. This is one reason in medieval times so many women were branded as witches, because women were disproportionately dependent upon the commons more than men, and they were often vilified and criminalized for sharing and partaking of the commons the way they had historically after enclosures. We see that today with so-called piracy on the internet, where people are sharing things and this is branded as criminal. And the whole idea that mutual support and provisioning should be made criminal is really offensive, especially in the light of the context of bare survival. This is not a new trend, in other words.
We're also seeing this in terms of serving food in public, free food to the public, that is being criminalized all across the U.S. It's a real concern of mine. I think this is where, this beautiful moment of history all collides into an amazing little nutshell of the effectiveness of civil disobedience and non-cooperation in withdrawing the authority of these powers that want to privatize everything, and only in upholding the laws we wish to see in the world. This is where nonviolent struggle actually is extremely effective in removing the authority of the abusive state power and putting legitimacy of the governing capacity in that which the people want to see. And it will be very interesting to watch Detroit and how Detroit plays out over the next couple weeks, because they're really in a crux of this issue right now. And I'm hoping to see some very exciting developments. David, I wanted to ask you a little bit about private property, and one of the myths of private property that I was reading in one of your articles comes out of a let's say, a shallow interpretation of John Locke, in which he actually wrote that people have the right to private property so long as the public good is met. But it seems like we've dropped off that last part. How did that develop? How did that happen?
Well, John Locke was trying to provide a philosophical justification for a lot of imperial powers at his time, and his theories of private property emerged out of that. So he realized that he developed a labor theory of value, that if you added your own personal labor to the land, say, that entitled you to own it. And he did have this, what's called the Lockean proviso, in which he added, almost as an afterthought, so long as there is a good enough for the rest of people in common, or that's a paraphrase. But of course, most people have forgotten that. And his theories of private property have been used to justify essentially the seizure of lands from indigenous peoples and the Native Americans, because it was the colonists, after all, who were using their labor to create value, and the Native Americans had not developed it, quote, and they didn't have a formal written legal title the way Western Europeans did, and this was the justification for seizing it. Of course, and one likes to think that this is historically past, but the same rationales have been used for so-called biopiracy in a lot of countries in the global south, where multinational pharmaceutical or agricultural biotech companies will seize genetic diversity in India or Madagascar or Africa and say, this belongs to us because we did a little genetic tweak to it and therefore we now own it, even though the indigenous community may have cultivated that crop or plant for generations. So this is a very persistent legalistic rationale for enclosure of the commons.
When you talk the commons with people today, how do you work to get across the very deep philosophies that underlie this notion? I mean, we've covered, even in this short discussion, is not a small rethinking of what we experience as normal today. It's actually a major readjusting to everything that we think is right in the world as a culture and society. How do you talk to people about this?
Well, I think you can take many on-the-ground, here-and-now realities as a microcosm that gives you an access to the larger philosophical discussion. I mean, how ridiculous is it that Mickey Mouse can be owned as private property for generations upon generations, or that, as I mentioned, some of these words can be owned as trademarks? You could take whatever local circumstance and start to extrapolate why this is and what it means. But it does mean breaching the conventional terms of discussion that, for example, the two major political parties will use. And you're right, it's often not immediately understood. It may be confusing, but I think it's precisely because it's a new terminology, a new language that is designed to illuminate things that have been deliberately obscured or disguised. You know, in the early days of the environmental movement, people would say, what's this ecology you're talking about? You mean pesticides have something to do with birth defects, have something to do with disease? You know, and people didn't understand this alien logic that was being introduced in the 1950s and 60s. Well, I think in a similar fashion, the Commons is trying to open up a new sort of discussion and illuminate things that the two political parties and the market state duopoly really don't want us to look at, think about, or challenge. But that, as I say, is precisely the value of talking about the commons.
That's the tension then that we're exploring right now, is the tension between the need to extract a profit from the commons as opposed to the need to extract common value from the commons. We'll be back with more from David Bollier on the subject of the commons. But first, Rivera and I are going to ruminate on what we've learned about the commons so far. It's kind of a different way of looking at the world. You're listening to Occupy Radio from KWVA Eugene and the Pacifica Radio Network, streaming at kwvaradio.org and podcasting at occupythemedia.podomatic.com. I'm your host, David Getchy, Sierra Lupe. All right, Rivera, I have not done my homework on this show about the commons, but thankfully, you've let me know that I can cheat off your paper, right?
Right, it's all common.
Ah, very good.
One thing that interested me about speaking with David Bollier about the commons is I'm working on a new novel. Now that you're almost done with the Dandelion Insurrection and Steam Drills, everyone is getting around to reading that one. It's time to bring out another one, and one of the major themes of it is the commons and the history of the commons. And it's caused me to reflect on all sorts of things in our modern world that are very much directly affected by this grand theft that happened. And I like how David points out that it's cultural theft. It's not just the land or the resource that we are losing. It's the culture of common resources, the culture of community problem solving and management and stewardship of not just a resource, but our relationship to resources.
And our relationship to each other as we deal with those resources is actually more important in some respects than the actual resources themselves. That we have to act in the common interest.
Right. And how does that affect us, not just on a cultural level, but on an individual level? I mean, all of our spiritual practices are rooted in this concept that we have to learn to balance the ego or the individualistic notion of self and our relationship to the world, and the inherent interconnection of our reality that we share with all of the rest of creation. And I think if we're not in the practice every day of thinking on those terms, we're really missing out on a big part of the truth of who and what we are.
Who and what we are. If you look down the generations, is that what you're talking about? How we have these things that define us, but if we use them up, then they no longer define us and they no longer aid us? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, that's true too. I was thinking more about the fact that we are interconnected beings, that there is no real separate individualistic reality. So being interconnected means that we have to work together to live on this planet. It's not really an option. And our culture really promotes this idea that we can have atomized, separated lives from one another, and it causes a lot of unhappiness. I mean, depression is very much directly related to the atomization of people and cultures. So when we talk about the commons and the theft of the commons, as you said, we've lost the experience of working together, and when I say that experience, it's also this experience of our real nature as interconnected beings. I mean, That's powerful stuff.
It is. And it's old-fashioned thinking that seems inefficient. And you and David both covered this in the interview, but I think it still is something that is worthy of bringing back up again, the idea that the commons is an ancient concept that has served mankind for millennia and served us reasonably well. I mean, it did get us to the point where the corporations could take things over and privatize them all and reap a huge profit. And I think if you were to chart, say, quality of life, I'm certain quality of life for humans has improved during the time of the corporate rule. But I suspect the rise in quality of life terminated a good 40 to 50 years ago, and quality of life has been dropping since then. And going back to the commons might very well be the way to reintroduce quality of life.
Yeah, well, People have a vested interest in quality of life. Corporations and elites don't have a vested interest in our quality of life. And we always have to keep that in mind. But if we're looking at that long trajectory of history, Getch, I think we need to recognize that this world wasn't always privatized. It wasn't even always owned by one tribe versus another. And so we have to really think long and hard about what quality of life is and where have we had rises and falls and what people would consider quality of life, and how does that relate to privatization or hierarchical nation states or tribal states. I think it's worthy of further investigation. One of the interesting applications of commons-based thinking at this moment in time has to do with the border kids, the immigrant children who are fleeing violence and coming across the U.S. border. What if there were no borders? What if the whole world was a place where we had to work together to manage the resources and our population base? And that it's not so much about, the U.S. conquered this territory and we decide what to do with it, but rather we have a global population, we have global problems, and how are we all going to work together to make sure everyone's needs are met?
Good questions, and hopefully in the second half of the show, David Bollier can come up with a few answers.
And we're back talking with David Bollier about the history and the importance of the commons.
Is copyright an inherently anti-commons concept?
I think that copyright in its original form tried to balance the two by giving a limited term of copyright or private control, a monopoly, which was then succeeded by it being in the public domain and available to everyone. Unfortunately, the original 16-year term of copyright now lasts for the lifetime of the author plus 70 years, which means that when I scribble something on a piece of paper, it's automatically copyrighted and will be private property till probably the year 2100. That's ridiculous. So yes, copyright in its current form is very anti-commons. But to get to the larger point of your question, I think there's really a challenge facing us to identify and develop new forms for stewarding collective resources, and not just being anti-enclosure, which of course we have to be, but being proactively creative in devising systems that are either legal, social, technological, for assuring that our shared resources remain shared resources and can't be appropriated, privatized, destroyed. So things like community land trusts, things like Creative Commons licenses and the general public license for open source software. There's all sorts of urban commons that are being devised. In Italy, there's people who are experimenting with city government having contracts with commons. So instead of a famous public-private partnership, you have a public-commons partnership where a commons fulfills certain activities that serve the public interest instead of a corporation. Which leads to the larger question: if the state can charter corporations ostensibly to serve the common good, the public good, why can't it charter commons to serve the public good in non-market ways?
I like that.
So as you see, there's a lot of room for legal innovation and organizational innovation, but there's no question there's a struggle to have these recognized by the state, because the liberal state is focused on individual property rights and almost cannot comprehend collective interests such as that. And paradoxically enough, the only collective interest it really recognizes is the collective interests of shareholders when they band together as corporations. So there's a real need for some collective innovation in law.
What about the rights of nature? If I threw that into this discussion of thought, we can have people joining together to manage or steward a common resource, but are there any forms of innovation that are assuring for the right of nature to survive in and of itself? We could say that given that our human existence is very entwined with all of the rest of nature, we could, hope that humans wouldn't just keep stripping out all the natural resources to the destruction of themselves and the nature. But I don't have that much faith in humanity at this point. Have you seen innovative systems around protecting the rights of nature?
Well, I know that Ecuador and Bolivia have been at the forefront of asserting the rights of nature with some irregular results in actually enforcing it as governments, because those governments have their own contradictions they have to deal with in terms of running a country and earning hard currency and so forth. That said, the rights of nature is a very, very important concept. I have my own skepticism that that idea can prevail in conventional courts because it's just too far out and radical for conventional courts. But I do think the idea of having the human right to common, meaning the human right to have access to the natural resources to preserve your livelihood, which is different from access to resources for market gain or profit or corporate control. But having the human right to common is one way that we can actualize the rights to nature, because generally collective groups that depend upon a natural resource and have a certain commitment to that land and to each other are going to be better stewards of it than either the government or the market. Unfortunately, they generally don't have legal recognition, which is why, for example, in Latin America, so many of those commons have been destroyed through NAFTA or trade treaties or simply the extractivist governments who want to displace the indigenous peoples to, rape the oil. So I guess what I'm saying is, as a legal doctrine, I don't think nature's rights is likely to have the throw weight or capacity to prevail in courts. When it's allied with the social practices of an active commons, I think it may have far more potential, and it could be a vehicle for them in protecting those rights.
Are you familiar, David, with the various resource economy movements that are cropping up these days? And do they reflect an attempt to, enlighten us as to the value of the commons? I mean, the resource economy movements tend to say that we need to take the resources that we rely on out of the capitalist structure and share them equally and develop a new economy through this reintegration, I guess, or reconfiguring of resources and economy. Is this something you're familiar with, and how does that fit into the whole idea of the commons?
I'm not familiar with it under those terms, although there are a number of movements I'm familiar with, such as the transition town movement, the degrowth movement, a lot of cooperatives, the solidarity economy, who seem to be trying to do what you've said. I guess I have reservations about focusing too exclusively on resources as resources rather than how those resources are socially and culturally integrated and managed. Meaning, in some ways, it's less about the resource and more about the community norms and practices. So we need to pay attention to those equally. And it's not just a matter of railing against capitalism. It's about affirmatively developing alternative systems that can work, that are seen as fair, that truly do respect ecological sustainability and so forth. So there are a lot of really fantastic experiments going on out there. I think more of them need to find each other and start a process of mutual learning to help to develop some new archetypes for alternative provisioning.
So the concept of resources and such isn't nearly as important as the concept of the community, which I was kind of picking up when you were talking about the waves in Hawaii, because it's certainly, in many respects, an unlimited resource in that the waves keep coming, but you can only access them at a certain rate.
Well, let me just qualify it a bit. To be sure, resources have different characteristics and will have different management things that have to occur as a result. Online, information is virtually free and can be copied easily. So there, it's not a question of free riders. It's a matter of organizing and curating the information in an accessible, orderly way. On the other hand, a lot of natural resources are depletable and finite. And so there you do indeed have a problem of how to limit access and how to monitor for people who violate the rules and so forth. But I get back to the social thing because it's about the social norms becoming integrated with that particular and sometimes local circumstances. One of my favorite stories is how Elinor Ostrom, who was the Indiana University economist who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for studying the commons, notably the year after the financial crisis. They wanted to have a different sort of economist that year. But Eleanor Ostrom once pointed out to me the practice in Boston, where in certain neighborhoods, if you shovel out your parking space after a big snow, there's an understanding within that neighborhood that if you put a beat-up old chair or piece of furniture there, you're entitled to park your car there for the duration of the snow. And Ostrom said to me, that's a commons. And I sort of said, well, what are you talking about? And she said, well, it's a shared understanding for the allocation of a scarce resource, parking spaces. And what's notable about that is that was kind of a neighborhood commons, which had a very different logic and ethic than the city government that totally despises this practice because they say we're in charge of the snow and the snow plowing, and we don't want any neighborhood making their own rules for how this is done. And I tell this story because it illustrates a certain tension between the self-organized governance of a commons and the bureaucratic rules of a government, which may or may not carry out those rules very well. So it's kind of a lesson on how we have these different forms of governance that we need to think a little more explicitly about.
I actually live, David, on one of the examples you cite in an article of yours about current commons systems, which is I live in New Mexico, and we actually have a little 1-acre garden on an acequia. And the acequia system of northern New Mexico, which was put in place by the Spanish, who learned it from the Moors when they invaded Spain. It's truly a remarkable thing in a region of water scarcity. And we're fairly lucky this year because we've had a wet year, but when water gets scarce, the mayor domo, who is the guy who decides where the water goes, he's in charge of it. And yet he's held in check by the fact that he lives in the community, or she, it could be a she as well. And the use of the water is decided through kind of both a communal system and a hierarchical system, but it is a full system that is parallel to the state's water system. And it leads to some very interesting dynamics.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that's one of my favorite commons, both because of its longevity and success, but also as a counterexample to state-based efforts and so-called market development approaches, which basically are constitutionally unable to limit their consumption. So acequias are so fantastic in providing a way of both providing access to water, but protecting it over the long term in ways that are seen as fair by everyone in a participatory way. So I love that example as an inspiration, an example to us all.
Yeah, and it's very cool because you do have to track the entire use of the resource. I mean, you cannot actually separate one part of the stream from the next. And so as you live in these commons, you start to really learn how to be an interconnected being to your whole system. And the reality is that we live in an interconnected world, and we have to learn these lessons if we are to survive. It's just, there's a lot of examples, as you know, and they teach us all so much when we start to look at them.
I think that you make a really excellent point that really the commons is not so much a definitive statement of things so much as an invitation or scaffolding for starting to understand our interdependencies, the intergenerational nature of things, the holistic nature of things, as opposed to these rather piecemeal, self-interested, atomistic ways of looking at things. So it invites you into a different sensibility and worldview than conventional politics or market economics allows.
Now, I'm learning quite a bit about the concept of the commons in this discussion. I entered into it thinking about it in an entirely different sense. But what we haven't touched upon is the privatization angle, which is, I mean, we've touched upon it a bit, but we haven't really dove into it yet, and we've got about 10 minutes left. And privatization strikes me as the main threat to the commons, and it's something that's ongoing and accelerating, I believe, the enclosures of the commons. Could we maybe explore the threat to the commons through privatization?
Sure. I prefer not to talk about privatization alone because in some ways that doesn't capture, for me, the broad dispossession and violation that enclosure involves, but of course privatization is a major part of it. But I want to emphasize that when an enclosure occurs, it's often decimating a way of life. It's destroying a community. It's converting one set of values that were stable, traditional, focused on community sustainability, and introduces a whole nother set of private, individualistic, often exploitative market norms. So there's a broader, what shall I say, valence of meaning with enclosure than privatization alone. But let me just move on that, enclosure really is a pervasive outrage and scandal of our time because it just affects so many areas of life. And many people don't even realize the corporate naming rights of sports stadiums is really kind of a grotesque cultural dispossession in which whoever has the most money can rename the baseball or football stadium, and whatever sports lore and culture had accumulated around a team or a stadium name bought out and gone. I've already mentioned some things like...
That probably touches Rivera really close to her heart, too.
Actually, it's Getch who's the sports fan, but...
Well, it's not to say it's against sports. It's against this corporate cultural appropriation of the lore of a team I find very offensive. I haven't talked too much about infrastructure being privatized. We talked a little bit about the internet, and the whole attack on net neutrality is an attempt to privatize the infrastructure of the internet. But it's very similar to what Microsoft did with computer operating systems and Windows. Infrastructure is really attractive to us because it allows them to gain revenues indefinitely into the future. In Chicago, for example, a lot of investment companies and hedge funds engineered the privatization of revenues from parking meters. And this is going to go on for decades, in which the city has essentially securitized and sold that revenue stream, something that ought to belong to the city government and taxpayers, but has basically been squandered. And I might add, with worse service than before. Well, this is playing itself out in a lot of arenas where highways are being sold, airports are being sold, a lot of civic infrastructure is being sold, in part because privatization is, first of all, not only squeezed so much of public budgets, now they're going after for the equity assets to try to control them as well. They're just too lucrative to ignore. So this, is part of the larger trend of enclosure, which has many different manifestations. I've mentioned some of the intellectual property ones, the public lands, the airwaves, the internet, urban spaces. So it's really kind of a pervasive phenomena of our time in which capital is seeking more private gain and finds that public assets or unowned, quote, assets are the path of least resistance.
Again, that takes us back to Detroit, where the emergency financial managers are selling off public resources on pennies on the dollar and giving away, like Benton Harbor, where they gave away a public park. I think they just gave it away from what I hear from the interviews.
Well, in Detroit, creditors are trying to seize billions of dollars worth of art that had been donated to the city. Well, at what point does the city cease to mean a city when you can sell off everything, including legacy priceless artifacts? So This is the situation we find ourselves in.
I think also one thing that comes up in this conversation between capitalism, predatory capitalism, the commons, all these big long words that mean a lot of things, is also our inability to grasp value outside of the market economy, that there's a lot of externalities that aren't accounted for, and there's a lot of, let's say, woo-woo things that we just can't reckon with. Like, what does that art mean to the future generations of Detroit? What does it mean culturally, intellectually, emotionally, psychologically? These are things that capitalism has never been able to account for. And my question for you, David, is, are these values better accounted for in a commons-based system?
Absolutely, because a commons focuses on the relationships and qualitative values and rarely presumes that some number or quantitative measurement is really going to capture the value. And I think you're absolutely right. This is a crisis of value in which our culture has driven us to see only monetized, market-based value and not the richer spectrum of value, which is precisely what it means to be human. So this is our struggle to try to recover that broader sense of value and humanity, and it is a struggle.
Now, in your wildest imaginings, Do you ever imagine that we may actually have a commons revolution?
Well, we may or may not, but in some ways, this makes sense to me. And I think that at times, if we focus too much on the externals, we're never going to get anywhere because we're going to be bargaining or being tactical or short term. This makes sense to me at a very deep level. And I think there are other people out there who believe the same thing. I know that in Europe and the global South, the commons is a far more advanced concept than in the United States. John Lennon said, war is over if you want it. I think in some ways the commons can exist if we want it. It's a matter of asserting it, and I think a lot of us feel it, and I think a lot of us know that the vision of fulfillment and progress, so-called, that our contemporary political market culture offers is not going to deliver. So I think the commons has a lot of potential for focusing, channeling, amplifying the energy that a lot of us feel, which I think the Occupy movement did a whole lot to express.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I like the fact that we're ending the show, which we are about to do on a up note there. And we're talking right now with David Bollier, who is a scholar, an activist, and author most recently of Think Like a Commoner. And you can also find David's blog at bollier.org. And we're wrapping up the show right now, David, but we have about a minute or so if you have any last thoughts you want to share with our listeners.
Well, I think that a lot of people ask me, well, what can I do? How can I become involved in the commons? And my general response is, well, what are you talented at? What are you passionate at? And most likely, you're going to find other people who share those talents and passions, whether it's online or in your local community. And most commons start in that fashion. What's around you, what's nearby, what can be done. It's very pragmatically oriented, but it's very visionary at the same time. So I think that there's lots of opportunities, but it requires imagination, commitment, resourcefulness. But we do have a lot of that, and sometimes more than other resources. So I'm very optimistic, despite the outward pessimism we might feel because of what we read in the newspaper. So I hope a lot of people will feel the same way about the commons.
Well, I know I do, David. So thank you so much for joining us on the show today, and I look forward to future conversations.
Thanks for having me on.
And you can find out more about David Bollier's work on the commons, his articles, books, and podcasts at www.bollier.org. That's BOLLIER.org.
You're listening to Occupy Radio, which is part of Occupy the Media. And Occupy the Media is the name of a podcast series, but it's also a mission statement.
Because in the age of corporate media, reporting the truth becomes an act of resistance.
Occupy Radio is one of 6 excellent Occupy and social justice related shows you can find every week at occupythemedia.podomatic.com.
On Sunday, you can listen to All Power to the Positive. Monday is Mic Check Radio. Tuesday, we air Clearing the Fog Radio. Wednesday is Occupy Radio. Thursday, Talk Nation Radio. Friday is Air Occupy. And you can find them all at occupythemedia.podomatic.com.
Occupy the Media!
Occupy Radio is produced through KWVA 88.1 FM on the campus of the University of Oregon. Nathan Stevens is our producer, and we have support from OEMG, the Occupy Eugene Media Group.
Thanks this week to our guest, David Bollier, and as always, thanks to my co-host, Rivera Sun.
Drop us a line at Occupy Radio 23 on Twitter and Gmail. We're Occupier Radio on Stitcher and iTunes, where you can give us a 5-star review if you feel inclined. You can find us on Facebook on the Occupier Radio group page, and we are occupyradio.org.
For Occupy Radio, I'm David Getchy, Sierra Lupe. The commons have been a staple of humankind for millennia, occupiers. It's gone by the wayside for a couple centuries now, but it may still offer solutions to many of our problems of resources and our environment. So what do you say? Let's all ponder some commons-based solutions to our current fix by the time we talk to you next week.